Imagine a world where a single misstep, a glance held too long, a bow delivered too late, could cost you your life. A world where silence was safer than speech, and survival depended on knowing your place. Exactly, precisely, without question. Where the streets weren't just paths through a city, they were battlegrounds of honor. Where a samurai, displeased for a heartbeat, could test the sharpness of his blade. On your spine, no trial, no warning, just steel. This was not madness. This was not chaos. This was order. As defined by the iron code of Bushido, a world where fire was not just a destroyer of homes, but an executioner, where boiling water was poured slowly, methodically, not to extract a confession, but to teach a lesson, where crucifixion wasn't foreign, it was public, celebrated, and drawn out over days, where women could be buried alive for infidelity, and thieves branded, mutilated, then paraded for the crowd, not as men, but as warnings. Here, justice didn't wear a blindfold, it wore armor. It rode on horseback, and it bled authority. Welcome to medieval Japan. Boiling alive, Kamayude. In medieval Japan, arson wasn't just a crime, it was treason against society. It wasn't a mere offense against property, it was a threat to the very foundation of order, livelihood, and survival. And for such a crime, there was one punishment so savage, so visceral, that it mirrored the destruction the arsonist had caused. Kamayude, boiling alive. Picture this, a towering iron cauldron, resting atop a bed of roaring flames, steam rising like a ghost from the surface, water bubbling, angrily, violently, beneath a shroud of smoke. The air is thick with sweat, incense, and dread. Crowds gather in silence, not out of bloodlust, but out of duty, to see what happens to those who threaten the fragile peace. And there, at the center, the condemned, stripped of clothes, stripped of dignity, shaking, weeping, staring down into the churning bath of death. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't some twisted exaggeration. Kamayude was real. It was most commonly used on arsonists, those who set fire to granaries, merchant homes, entire districts, those who disrupted the delicate social fabric with a single spark. In Kanazawa, an administrative hub of the Edo period, official records detail its use on repeat offenders, or those found guilty of killing influential household heads. This was poetic justice, Tokugawa style. You brought fire, then into fire, you go. But this wasn't just about retribution. It was about message, about memory. The Tokugawa shogunate knew something crucial. Fear was a tool, and spectacle was power. Throughout the Edo period, punishments were designed not only to penalize, but to deter, to etch terror into the minds of the common folk, to leave no room for doubt. Disorder would be met with overwhelming, unforgettable force. Kamayude was just one of many brutal instruments in their arsenal. Others included crucifixion, bodies nailed and left to rot under the sun, burning alive, sawing, decapitation, and even death by starvation in public cages. But Kamayude held a special place in the punishment lexicon because it was slow, public, and symbolic. So, why boiling? To modern eyes, it may seem excessive, barbaric even, but to the authorities of the time, it was logical. Fires in Edo-era Japan were not small, containable events. They were disasters, monstrous city-leveling infernos. Homes were made of wood and rice paper, built tightly together in labyrinthine neighborhoods. A single flame could reduce entire districts to ash in minutes. Livelihoods lost, families displaced, temples, shrines, and records gone forever. And so the arsonist was not a mere criminal. He was an existential threat, a spark that could burn down society itself. Boiling him alive wasn't just punishment, it was theater. They became part of the air people breathed, a constant reminder. Order was sacred, and fire was betrayal. But what did it feel like to be the one lowered into that cauldron? Skin meets water, and it doesn't sting. It rips. The pain is instant, overwhelming. Nerve endings scream until they burn out. Muscles spasm violently. The mind fractures. Some pass out from shock. Others remain awake, thrashing, sobbing, baking alive while the crowd watches in silence. The moment becomes a blur of steam and agony. And for the condemned, there is no peace. Only heat. Only pain. By 1666, Kanazawa had abolished the use of boiling as a formal punishment. The nation, under increasing pressure to appear more civilized, began favoring quicker, more efficient methods. Decapitation became the new norm. But the memory of Kamayude lingered. Whispers of it passed down in oral histories, in village tales, and among the executioners themselves. And even today, in the old execution grounds outside Tokyo, there are places said to hold the silence of those screams. Places where cruelty, once public, has soaked into the earth. Boiling alive may no longer be used, but the idea, the warning, the horror, that never left. Death by crucifixion in medieval Japan was not just a punishment. It was a display, a slow, deliberate performance where the agony of one became the obedience of thousands. The method was called haritsuke. Unlike the Christian crucifixions of Rome, this wasn't about theology. It was about control, about spectacle, about turning death into a warning that could not be ignored. In the town square or along busy roadways, a rough wooden cross would be raised, tall, crude, impossible to miss. The condemned, often stripped and beaten, was either tied or nailed to it, arms outstretched, legs bound or skewered. Then, while still alive, executioners would take spears, long, narrow, razor-sharp, and drive them through the sides of the victim's body. Not through the heart, not for mercy, but through the ribs or beneath the collarbone, slow, precise, and often done in stages. The goal? To keep them alive just long enough to suffer, just long enough for the crowd to remember. Haritsuke was reserved for the worst: murderers, serial thieves, traitors, and in many cases, Christians. During the Tokugawa era, Christianity was outlawed, seen as a foreign threat to Japan's delicate social order. Those caught practicing the faith in secret, they were crucified not just to kill, but to send a message to their communities: This is what happens when you kneel to another god. After death, the story didn't end. The body was left to rot, to bloat in the summer heat, to stiffen in the winter frost, to be picked apart by birds and insects, a grotesque reminder of what happens when you challenge the status quo. And when decay had done its work, sometimes the head was severed, placed in a wooden cage known as a gibbet box. These boxes were mounted high on poles, so that even in death, the condemned would continue to watch. Imagine this. It's dusk. You're walking home from the rice fields. The sun has dipped just below the horizon. The wind carries the scent of smoke and soil. And as you turn a corner, there it is. A wooden pole, and atop it, a face you recognize. A neighbor, a merchant, a man who once smiled at your child. Now, hollow-eyed, mouth agape, skin peeling under the elements, not buried, not burned, displayed. That was the shogunate's message. Fear, permanence, obedience. Because the Tokugawa rulers understood one truth. You don't just punish crime. You burn the memory of that punishment. When boiling didn't suffice, they sawed people in half. Yes, sawed. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, methodically, as if carving a warning into the bones of a nation. The criminal, stripped, bound, was tied tightly to a wooden stake, sometimes upright, sometimes laid flat on a plank. Then, a bamboo saw was brought forward, not metal, not industrial, bamboo, flexible, serrated, and devastatingly sharp. It wasn't used in haste. It was pulled back and forth by two men, one on each side, working in rhythm, not to finish quickly, but to finish completely. Most times, the saw began at the neck, severing through flesh, muscle, cartilage, and eventually bone. Other times, the punishment was even more horrifying, waist cutting. A sentence so brutal, it had its own name, haranige. To be sawed through the waist was not just a death sentence, it was agony personified. You see, the torso holds more than bones. It holds the guts, the intestines, the core of the body. Sawing here meant the condemned would not die immediately. They would feel everything, the rupture of organs, the flood of blood, the body's desperate attempt to stay alive, long after hope was gone. And if the executioners made a mistake, if the saw slipped, if it became dull, if their hands faltered from exhaustion or fear, the condemned wouldn't die faster. They would die slower, and in some tragic cases, not at all. At least not at first. There are reports of executions gone wrong, where the blade halted midway, and the crowd watched as the victim, still conscious, still breathing, lay twitching in his own blood, begging for an end that wouldn't come. Because in medieval Japan, punishment wasn't only about death. It was about suffering. It was about turning pain into memory. Haranige was a statement. You didn't just break the law, you tore at the roots of harmony. So now, we will tear you apart in return. Witnesses were often forced to attend. Villagers, children, even family members. It was a civic lesson. One body broken, so 1,000 minds would never dare challenge order again. And after it was over, when the screams had faded, when the saw was tossed aside, and when the blood soaked deep into the earth, the silence returned. But it didn't bring peace. It brought a reminder. Not all punishments ended quickly. Some were designed to last. The goal wasn't just death. It was delay. A slow, creeping descent into agony. A punishment that unfolded not in seconds, but in hours. Sometimes even days. One of the most chilling methods? Tidal crucifixion. Criminals were bound to wooden crosses, arms spread, legs fastened, and placed at the edge of the shore. But not just anywhere. These were tidal flats, beaches where the sea recedes by day, only to return with vengeful force. The condemned would stand there, helpless, sun baking their skin, salt air burning open wounds. And then, as the hours passed, the water began to rise. First around the feet, then the knees, then the waist, then the chest, inch by inch, breath by breath, until the tide reached the mouth, then the nose, then nothing. There was no struggle, no escape, only the slow, suffocating weight of the sea. No blade, no fire, just water, cold, indifferent, and final. It was a public spectacle. Locals would gather on the shore. They would point. They would whisper. Children would be told, "That is what happens when you break the law." And by the time the tide receded, the cross would remain, and on it, a lifeless body, swaying gently in the wind, a reminder etched into the sand and into the memory of every villager who saw it. But while the sea could kill slowly, fire was far more theatrical. Burning at the stake, a punishment often reserved for arsonists, was both poetic and brutal. In a world built of wood, bamboo, and rice paper, fire was a weapon of mass destruction. One match could destroy hundreds of homes. So the punishment had to reflect the magnitude of the crime. And so the arsonist was taken, dragged through the streets, beaten, paraded, then bound tightly to a wooden pole, surrounded by brush, straw, and timber, sometimes soaked in oil, sometimes wrapped in kindling like a torch. A crowd would gather, not just to watch, but to listen, to the crackle of flame, to the screams, to the slow collapse of a human voice into silence. And still the authorities weren't satisfied. They wanted the flames to last, so they coated the body with straw to keep it burning evenly, with oil to make the fire cling to skin, with tar to make the suffering last just a few moments longer. It wasn't just execution, it was ritual. For the worst crimes there was death, but for the lesser ones, disobedience, insults, drunken brawls, petty theft, insulting a samurai, or simply breaking the rigid codes of social conduct, there were punishments that didn't end in death, but lasted a lifetime. Japan had more surgical solutions. The goal wasn't just to inflict pain, but to mark you, to turn your body into a permanent reminder of your failure. The ears sliced off, cleanly, deliberately, sometimes with a knife heated in flame, sometimes with a swift slice from a wakizashi blade. It wasn't for silence, It was for humiliation. The nose, gone. Amputated in front of crowds, a face forever altered, because without ears or a nose, you were no longer fully human. You were a warning. But the most haunting of all was the mark burned into the skin, or carved into the forehead, a single character. An. It meant criminal, not figuratively, literally. It was tattooed or branded into your flesh just above the eyes, so that every time someone looked at you, they saw your crime. You could never hide, not in a new village, not under new clothes, not even in death. Because in the afterlife, it was believed, your soul carried the mark too. Some were lashed, not with whips, but with wooden clubs, thick, heavy, unyielding, 100 lashes on the bare back, delivered by trained enforcers, men who knew how to break skin without ending life. Each blow struck with calculated cruelty. The skin would split, blood would pour, and with each strike, the criminal would fall deeper into agony. Some survived, barely, crawling home, skin shredded, fevered from infection. Others died days later, not from the lashes themselves, but from the sickness that followed. But survival was never the point. The point was shame, a kind of slow death that stretched across years, a punishment you carried on your face, your body, and your soul. You became a living scar, a cautionary tale in human form. No one would hire you, no one would marry you. Children would cry when they saw your face, and you'd see your reflection each morning, the same branded character staring back, a reminder that no matter how small the crime, the system would ensure you never forgot it. In medieval Japan, not all executions ended in death. Some were simply life extended in ruin. Imagine walking home after dusk. The air is quiet. Lanterns flicker in the distance. Your footsteps echo on the dirt path until you sense a presence. Emerging from the shadows, a man steps forward, not a thief, not a guard, but a samurai, clad in dark robes, blade glinting faintly in the moonlight. He says nothing. He doesn't demand your money. He doesn't accuse you of anything. Because your crime was simply being there. This was Kubi-kiri, crossroads killing, a deadly tradition whispered through the Edo streets. A samurai, having just acquired a new katana, might feel the urge to test it. Not on a straw dummy, not on a tree, but on you, a passing peasant, a merchant, a farmer's son walking home from market. The victim was random, the strike, precise. A clean cut. No warning, no trial, just a flash of steel and silence. This was not considered murder in the modern sense. It was called tameshigiri, blade testing. And in some cases, it was considered a privilege of the warrior class, a deadly cocktail of ego, tradition, and unchecked power. In 1602, the practice was officially outlawed by the Tokugawa shogunate. But outlawed does not mean extinguished. The shadows don't care about laws, and neither did all samurai. For years, Kubi-kiri continued in secret, a crime hidden beneath a veil of honor, a blade wiped clean before morning light. But one case would change everything. 1696, a nobleman, Sanosuke Ishikawa, born into status, trained in the arts of the sword, but said to be mentally unstable, began a killing spree in Edo. Not one or two, dozens. He roamed the streets by night, striking down innocents without warning. Women, children, even monks. At first, the authorities refused to believe it. A nobleman, a samurai. Impossible. But the bodies piled up, and the people began to whisper. The demons walk in human skin. When Sanosuke was finally apprehended, he showed no remorse, only confusion. To him it was not murder. It was art, practice, a ritual carried out by blood and steel. His trial shocked the empire, and though justice was delivered swiftly, his execution public and brutal, the fear remained. Because Tsujigiri was not just about death, it was about power without consequence, a reminder that under the layers of law and order lurks something feral, something ancient, something that wore the face of honor, but wielded a sword in the dark. Even after the law changed, even after the empire evolved, people still feared the crossroads. There was one punishment in medieval Japan not rooted in shame, but in honor, a privilege reserved for the warrior class, a death on their own terms. It was called seppuku, self-disembowelment. A samurai, disgraced, whether for failure, treason, or perceived dishonor, could choose to end his life with ritual dignity, in silence, in control, in pain. But with purpose, he would kneel, dressed in white, his wakizashi blade placed before him, a witness, often many, watching. Then, without hesitation, he would take the blade, plunge it into his abdomen, and slice left to right, a gesture of both spiritual and physical courage. This was not just death, it was atonement. But it did not end there. Standing behind him was the Kai Shakunin II, a trusted companion, often a close friend, sword drawn, hands steady, tasked with delivering the final mercy, decapitation. Not full, never full, just enough to sever the spine, so the head would not roll, because even in death, form mattered. Presentation mattered. The samurai died with blood on his kimono, steel in his stomach, but honor intact. But for the commoner, there was no honor, no ritual, no white robe, no kaishakunin, only punishment. The same crime, a political insult, a failed duty, a stolen coin, might bring a samurai to a silk-draped tatami room, and a farmer to a stake, stripped, beaten, and beheaded like cattle. The law was never about fairness, it was about structure. A samurai could redeem himself in death. A peasant could only pay with it. Even in execution, there was a hierarchy, and so, across Japan, two deaths unfolded in parallel. One, a solemn silence broken only by breath and blade. The other, a scream in the dirt, unheard and unremembered. Two people, same crime, two different endings. That was the way of feudal law. These punishments didn't just control behavior. They shaped society itself. Because when justice is public, when death is theater, it becomes something more than law. It becomes culture. Executions weren't hidden in quiet chambers. They were staged, choreographed, designed to be seen, remembered, feared. Children watched as men were boiled, burned, or crucified, not as horror, but as lesson. Mothers would hoist their sons on their backs to see above the crowd. Fathers would point and say, "This is what happens when you disobey." Families walked past rotting heads in gibbet cages on their way to the rice market. The smell, the flies, the hollow eyes of the condemned, now lifeless. And no one screamed, no one cried. They just looked and kept walking. Because in Edo, Japan, fear wasn't an emotion. It was a tool, a building block, a necessary thread in the fabric of obedience. And it worked. Crime rates dropped. Order was maintained. The Tokugawa shogunate ruled for over 250 years with relative peace. But at what cost? Cost in Soko, what confrains to beheading? How many children grew up with the sound of screams in their memory? How many people learned compliance not out of belief, but out of terror? What happens to a society when pain becomes public policy? When punishment becomes performance? When silence isn't peace, but trauma with good manners? The fear did its job. People bowed lower, spoke softer, obeyed faster. But behind those calm eyes, there was something else, something no punishment could ever fully erase: resentment, dread, rebellion waiting patiently. Because even in the quietest, most orderly society, fear always plants a seed. By the mid-1800s, everything began to change. The Meiji Restoration swept through Japan like a new wind, carrying with it the promise of modernization, of railways, factories, and constitutional law. And with that shift, the old ways began to vanish. Most of the medieval punishments, the boiling, the crucifixions, the public lashings, were formally abolished, outlawed, buried beneath the ideals of a new Western-influenced justice system. But the scars remained, not just in books or records, but in the very landscape of Japan. Places once soaked in suffering now stand silent. Take Suzugamori, once a seaside execution ground where criminals were tied to posts and drowned by the tide. Today, it's a quiet neighborhood in Tokyo. A small stone marker remains, incense burns beside it, and locals pass by without a second glance. Or Kozukapara, one of the largest execution sites in Edo. Over 100,000 people are believed to have died there, beheaded, burned, buried. Today, it sits beside a train line, surrounded by trees, a cemetery now, where flowers grow where blood once flowed. Time has smoothed the edges, but beneath the soil, beneath the shrines and memorial tablets, lie the echoes of screams no one can hear anymore. We look back now from a distance and recoil in horror, but these punishments didn't arise from cruelty alone. They came from a system, a worldview, a time that valued order over chaos, obedience over freedom, fear over mercy. It was a society built on discipline, but one that carried its peace like a sword, sharp, silent, and always ready to draw blood. And so the question lingers: were they civilized for maintaining order, or brutal for how they achieved it? And if fear is what kept society in line, then what, truly, is the price of peace? That's a question they never asked, and one we must keep asking today. If this video shocked you, if it made you pause, or taught you something you never knew about the world that came before us, consider subscribing. Not for the algorithm, not for the numbers, but because history, especially its darkest corners, deserves to be remembered. Every crucifixion, every boiling, every silent act of obedience, done under the shadow of fear. These aren't just facts in a textbook. They are warnings, reminders of how far society can go in the name of order, and how easily cruelty can be dressed as justice. So if this story resonated with you, share it, pass it on, because the past only disappears when we stop looking, and some things should never be forgotten. Next week, we leave the blood-soaked streets of feudal Japan and enter the golden sands of the ancient world. But not the Egypt you think you know, not the pyramids, not the pharaohs. This time, we explore the forbidden side of history. What was sex really like in ancient Egypt? What did they desire, fear, worship? What taboos did they break, and which ones did they invent? From divine unions with gods to rituals we still don't dare speak aloud. Desire, power, magic, and secrets buried beneath 5,000 years of silence. Subscribe now so you don't miss what history left in the dark.